Welcome to this webinar titled Digging Deeper into Silvopasture. I'm Wayne Munson. I'm the Special Projects Coordinator with the SFA, and I'm serving as moderator for this webinar. We'd like to thank the North Central Sustainable Agriculture and Research and Education Professional Development Program for providing funding for this webinar. In this webinar, we're going to dig deeper into silvopasture and going into more detail on getting started, what to look for as you get started, establishing silvopasture from an open pasture, and converting a woodland into a silvopasture management system, and then delve into some potential funding sources to help with installing silvopasture, from statewide NRCS programs to an example of a local SWCD program. Presenters today are Diomy Zamora. He's a consultant to the SFA. Tyler Carlson, he's the SFA's Silvopasture and Agroforestry lead. Diane Mayerfeld, she's the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education statewide coordinator out of the University of Wisconsin Extension Service. Lance Smith, he's the NRCS State Rangeland Management Specialist. And Terri Peters, who's the District Manager of the Wabasha Soil and Water Conservation District. During these presentations, we'll have two times where we will take questions. After Tyler's and Diomy's presentations, and again after Diane, Lance's, and Terri's presentation. We ask that you type your questions into the chat box, and then I will moderate them and ask the questions to the panelists. And now here's here's Diomy to introduce what silvopasture is.
Thank you so much, Wayne, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us in this webinar. And we are really excited to share with you what really is happening in the context of silvopasture. And over the past few years, this is what we have been doing over in Minnesota, trying to promote this system as this practice as a sustainable agriculture or sustainable practice that can address environmental problems as well as provide economic benefits to our practitioners. Just for us to be in the same page, I just would like to briefly discuss with you the concept of silvopasture. So essentially, what is silvopasture? Silvopasture is among the 5 agroforestry practices, including alley cropping, windbreak system, riparian forest buffers, and forest farming. But today we are going to be focusing mostly on silvopasture. Just like what I have said earlier, silvopasture is an agroforestry practice that intentionally and sustainably produces trees or shrubs, as well as forests and livestock in a single integrated system. As you can see in the definition, this is a complex system because it has 3 components: the trees, the forage, as well as the livestock. In silvopastoral system or silvopasture, it really integrates the principles of forest management, as well as the principles of animal husbandry and forage management as one unit. So we really have to look at these different principles and come up with one system, and that is called silvopasture. And I believe that Lance is going to be describing later on what silvopasture is in the context of NRCS Conservation Practice Standard Trait 1. In silvopasture, just like what I have mentioned earlier, in order for it to be called silvopasture, it has to go through, it has to be evaluated based on the 4 I's. Intentional, meaning that we are intentionally integrating the trees, the forage, and the livestock together as one integrated unit, capitalizing the interaction of these different components to provide overall productivity of the system. And the management of this practice is very intensive because it requires, again, say for instance, thinning, or understanding of the forest requirement by the livestock, as well as the uh, fertilizer requirement of the forage. So that is essentially the definition of silvopasture. As I have said earlier, allowing livestock to graze into the forest without managing the livestock or the forage or the trees together is not considered silvopasture, nor one or two trees in the landscape is considered as silvopasture. Uh, in Minnesota, we have about 640,000 acres of land that is under unmanaged woodland grazing, where livestock are put roaming around into the forest, and that's the issue that we are trying to address using the concept of silvopasture. There are two ways in which silvopasture can be established. One is uh, establishing forage into the forest, or adding trees into the pasture. We are going to be looking at this in more detail during the next few slides. So essentially, that is the concept of silvopasture. In a nutshell, it's just the integration of trees and livestock and forest together as one management unit, applying the principles of animal husbandry, forest management, and forage management. I'm going to have Tyler talk about how to get started with silvopasture, and he's going to talk uh, on site assessment. Tyler?
Thank you, Diomy. There we go. Let's see if I've got control. Okay, great. Yeah, welcome everyone. I'm Tyler Carlson, the SFA Silvopasture and Agroforestry project lead. Today I'm taking you through a few short slides on really just introductory sort of goal setting and site assessment evaluation for people who are really just starting to think about silvopasture. So it's really asking questions like, is silvopasture right for me and or my site that I'm working with? What kind of silvopasture is right for this site and my management goals, and what might it look like? And what's it going to take to get there? What's it going to take to establish and manage the system in an ongoing fashion? So the first thing to do, in my opinion, is to start with the goal setting exercise. You know, we pay a lot of lip service to goal setting in management systems, but we really do need to spend a little bit of time at the outset going through a process of writing down and specifically articulating the goals for a silvopasture project. And so one of the first questions I ask, particularly for folks who have an existing system, let's see here, I've got a lag. You know, first off, if you have an existing operation, if you're attempting to address specific problems or issues, and that's what's brought you to silvopasture, it's important to write that down. If you've got specific environmental or production, you know, shortcomings or issues that you're attempting to address, you know, write that down, and that will be critical to helping think through a design process. Diving a little deeper, you know, primarily a good question to start with is whether or not you're primarily concerned with livestock performance and comfort. There are many different benefits and reasons to get into silvopasture, but for many folks, the short-term benefits are going to come for livestock. And so whether or not that's a priority is valuable to have that highlighted. And also, if livestock comfort and performance is important, also outlining whether that is a summer heat stress performance that you're looking to benefit, or, you know, to what extent winter. If you're outwintering cattle and you're looking for that winter shelter benefit from silvopasture, that also plays an important role in how one might design, you know, the planting sort of shape and orientation, as well as the species of trees, if you're planting trees into an existing pasture. If timber harvest is your specific goal and long range, high quality timber is of priority, you know, It's important to have that laid out at the beginning. Additionally, for some folks, they're more interested really in just restoring sort of habitat or ecological function to a piece of land. They're trying to restore soil. They're trying to restore woodland, habitat and ecological function. And it's important to highlight that, and also to detail whether or not native plants or non-native introduced plants are really optional. For some folks, they're really after a native restoration, and highlighting that at the beginning is good for system design. In addition, looking at short-term income, how important short-term income is, relative to long-range profitability of the system. If you're looking for, if getting income quickly is critical, then we really are looking at, trying to maximize income from either tree harvest, or more likely is trying to increase the amount of forage as quickly as possible to be generating income from that land. And that can be, helpful for figuring out how a system may be designed. In addition, all that are any sort of other land uses beyond, primary forage production for livestock and potential timber harvest. What other land uses are you currently and or hoping to utilize this land for, whether that's just birding or hiking, just sort of general nature use. Is this a piece of woods that is hunted in the fall? Do you like to wildcraft or forage for certain things in a forested setting? Those alternative uses should be factored into a management plan and design at the beginning of the system. So like for our farm, we hunt the silvopasture, the converted silvopasture sites in our woodland settings. And so I remove livestock starting around mid-August to stockpile forage and reduce the amount of sort of general busyness in the forest in preparation for the fall hunting season. And those are things to consider at the outset. And I think it's important. A lot of folks come to silvopasture and they have an interest in really all of these things. That's kind of why silvopasture is so exciting, because we can get, all of these wonderful things. But I think it's good to help and try to do your best to prioritize, what's most important in of all of these, sort of purported and hopeful benefits for the system, because it will really help guide one's management decisions and really how you gauge success of those decisions and the system as a whole as it evolves through time. Additionally, something to be aware of at the outset are the potential financial considerations, primarily the costs and the funding sources for establishing silvopasture. The cost associated with silvopasture can be substantial, and that can come in the form of logging and brush management. The cost of addressing a buckthorn infestation or a hazelnut infestation. A hazelnut, dominated shrub layer can be substantial, as well as the cost of logging if there is little to no marketable valuable timber within the system. Those costs can reach into the thousands of dollars per acre very quickly. On the other hand, planting trees into pasture, the other route of establishing silvopasture, can also be expensive, and understanding that there is a cost for trees and pasture seed and site prep and the establishment of those trees and pasture. Additionally, this is a livestock grazing system in which fence and water materials and their installation may be required, which also carry substantial monetary and labor costs. The labor for the system maintenance and grazing management in the early years of establishment are also substantial and need to be, you should be aware that there is a need to allocate additional labor for the management of trees and brush and livestock in these systems before they're, really fully mature. And in addition to that, for trees planted into open pasture, there is a likely near-term income loss from the areas that are planted into trees. Those trees take time to mature to be able to withstand grazing by livestock. And so there is a certain amount of acreage there that is no longer producing an annual income from other crops. And so just to be aware that there is some portion of land that is being removed from production for the short term. Potential funding sources for establishing these systems are, revenue from forest thinning in some areas, and with some, within some woodland and forest systems, there's enough valuable timber to really pay for, in fact, actually generate net income from the, sort of initial thinning and conversion of a forested system. So possibly there is actually money to be generated from the actual work of setting up a converted forest into a silvopasture. In addition, there are grant and cost share programs available, some of which will be highlighted later today. And then there's, basically self-funding and or the system funding itself. If you're hoping to utilize goats or other livestock to do some of that work, they potentially can be doing that work while generating income in the process. But regardless of that, just understanding that, these systems typically take money to establish. And there are various ways to do that. And just to have a sense of the sort of landscape for funding is useful. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so assessing the management skills and labor, to some extent, some of this material, and these skills can be hired out, but much of it is really quite useful, and in some cases really critical to successful management of these systems. So what is your understanding of the science behind the benefits of silvopasture and how these systems function? That is, in silvopasture, the success of the system largely hinges upon favoring the positive interactions between the trees and the brush and the forage and the livestock, while minimizing the negative interactions between those components. And these systems, as highlighted earlier, are fairly complex. And so having, a fairly, a beyond introductory knowledge of what makes for, the positive outcomes of these interactions so that you can favor them as the system is evolving and growing is useful, if not critical, at some point. You don't need to know everything at the outset, but having a pretty good sense of how trees and sunlight and heat and temperature affect forage and how they affect livestock, so that you can manage that for your benefit, is critical to the ultimate success, at least the financial success of the system. Do you currently have livestock? Are they rotationally grazed and well-trained to portable electric fencing? You don't have to have livestock right away to be interested in silvopasture. I think many of the folks out there are, looking at getting into farming, and just recognizing that really animals that are well trained to electric fencing is going to make management and successful management of silvopasture systems much more likely. And I would suggest that you have some experience rotating livestock in a less complicated system, utilizing those materials and that type of infrastructure before one just starts working with livestock in a wooded forest or planted silvopasture setting. Do you have experience using a chainsaw and equipment to help with logging and brush management? That's primarily just a consideration of whether or not you might be able to do some of this work yourself. It's not a requirement to be involved in working with silvopasture, but it can be an option. In addition, if you are going to be working with silvopasture, there's the ongoing issue of trees falling on fences. That's an additional complication compared to open pasture. It's more likely to happen. And anyways, so there's always a need for a chainsaw and the ability to work with the sort of issues with infrastructure that can pop up in these systems. And then do you have experience planting trees, minimizing competition and protecting those trees from wildlife? If you're going to be planting trees, there's some knowledge and practice to be gained from understanding, the competition and things for young trees. Can you identify most of the plants growing on your farm and in local woodlands, particularly trees and shrubs? Can you identify valuable crop trees, invasive plants, and the noxious and potentially poisonous plants for livestock in your area? I would suggest that having a handle on, particularly if you're going to be doing a wooded conversion silvopasture system, that and putting livestock in there, that there are potentially poisonous plants, and it would be very useful to have a sense of how to identify those, which ones are poisonous, and potentially what it looks like when an animal is suffering from, early onset poisoning, and or you already have death loss, so that you can engage with the system to right, that problem if it presents itself. And then, do you or your farm team have sufficient available labor to apply to additional fence line maintenance, observation, and an increase in the frequency of livestock paddock moves? So again, these systems take a little bit more labor than an open pasture system. And one should just be aware that you're going to need to devote a little bit more time keeping an eye on the livestock while they're in there, because there are just a lot more components and things to get out of hand. Next slide, please. So then just real quickly, looking at an initial site history and current conditions sort of assessment, are there currently livestock there, and what is the type of fence and water system, and is it in sufficient working condition for your management plan? So just doing an assessment of the existing infrastructure and whether or not there's already been grazing impact in the recent history. Is there dense shade being cast by shrub or tree layers? Are there existing large oak trees present? Is there an existing dense aggressive shrub layer such as buckthorn or hazelnut that requires substantial management at the outset? And is there a well-established perennial grass dominated community in the understory? That can be a good thing, because you've already got forage established to work with. That can be potentially a downside if you're trying to do a native oak savanna type restoration, but you already have existing sod. That will make it difficult to establish native plants. And so those things just require, specific plans for addressing to reach your goals. If you're planting trees, what is the dominant soil texture in the site? That helps guide you towards different tree species that would be well adapted to that soil. What sensitive areas exist? Are there high organic matter soils, wet areas, or highly erodible soils and slopes that may warrant specific management? And then again, are there potentially poisonous, rare, or threatened plants that would warrant possibly exclusion from the system, or just specific management to maintain those plants? That's what I have. I'll be back for questions after Diomy's presentation.
All right. Thank you so much, Tyler. And again, as you have heard from Tyler, that establishing silvopasture has a lot of challenges in terms of skills, cost, and management.
Diomy?
Yes.
Before you get started into yours, I just want to remind people that we will be having 2 chat sessions after yours and Tyler's presentations, as well as at the end with the other 3.
Okay, yeah, they can type in their questions in the Q&A, and after my presentation, we are going to pause for questions. So anyway, what I am going to be discussing within the next 15 minutes would be just the key considerations in establishing silvopasture from open pasture. Just like what I have mentioned earlier, there are two ways of establishing silvopasture. One is establishing forays into the forest, and the one I'm going to focus right now is planting trees into to the open pasture, into your pasture, so to speak. That is another form of silvopastoral establishment. This particular approach is very much applicable, particularly if you have a degraded pasture land and you want to manage it and convert it into a silvopastoral system, or if you don't have a forest, so to speak, where you could bring your cows during high intensity of the heat, but you could take shelter on. This is another way to look at the benefits of silvopasture. So here are some key considerations in establishing silvopasture. Tyler has provided a good discussion or background about site assessment. I'm not going to be going to that principle because what he has discussed essentially is applicable to this establishment of silvopasture from open pasture. Assuming that you are going to be interested in establishing silvopasture in an open pasture, the first thing that you really have to consider is to prepare the site. Preparing the site involves reducing plant competition using tilling, mowing, or even using herbicides, as well as tree mass. As you can see in the picture on the lower corner, right corner of this slide, it shows a farm where only a section of the land is tilled where trees are to be planted. In setting up your silvopasture in an open pasture, it is really important for you to determine the level of your soil compaction, and we have technologies out there that can provide that purpose using a penetrometer. We in SFA, we don't really advocate subsoiling, but if the soil is too compacted, then subsoiling may be used in order to establish trees in a in an open system. At this stage, it is very important for you to consider determining fencing as well as the water needs for that particular site. So you really have to follow the same principles that you have been using in establishing pasture in your open system. After preparing the site, select the tree species based on your ultimate goal for that tree. And the ultimate goal that you might have for that tree would be to have high quality timber or for pulp and paper, as well as nut production, because the management as well as the planting design of silvopastoral system in an open pasture really depends on your management goals. In understanding and selecting the tree of choice, it is also important to understand the types of soil you have, as well as the characteristics of that soil, because some species are site specific. They can only thrive at a certain soil types. Here is a list of the different trees that could be applicable in a silvopastoral system in an open pasture: black walnut, bitternut hickory, white oak, red oak, bur oak, and I believe that at Tyler's farm will establish white pine as well as red pine in his farm, as well as red oak. So you can essentially work with your forester to identify what type of trees or suitable trees that could grow into your site. Another consideration in selecting the trees is the compatibility of the trees that you have chosen with forage as well as with livestock. We need to consider using species that are medium to fast growing. It has deep root systems in order to minimize the competition of nutrients and water between the trees and the forage, as well as the characteristics that that particular tree can provide with respect to canopy. Because again, the idea that we are going to be working on here is the integration of trees and forests together, making sure that the trees that we are going to be using in silvopastoral system will provide enough shade for the forest that we would like to grow. In terms of the considerations for planting the seeds, the seedling or trees, there are estate nurseries out there as well as commercial nurseries that can provide high quality trees. So it's important as well for you to make your reservation for the trees that you would like to plant from SWCDs in your local areas. Select seedlings with well-established root systems, because one of the challenges in silvopastoral system essentially is compaction of the soil by livestock. So therefore, it's important for us to identify what trees are necessary that can withstand with compaction. If possible, plant taller and vigorous seedlings in your system. Plant bare-root seedling in the spring generally leads to better seedling survival. And in terms of density in your area, generally the density is about 200 to 400 trees per acre, but work with your forester to determine the type of planting density as well as spacing for the particular species that you have chosen. In terms of planting design considerations, I believe it could either be either single row or multiple rows, depending on the requirements of EQIP. If you are going to be applying financial support from the EQIP program, and also planting design depends also on the characteristics of the potential tree species that you are going to be planting. Just like what is shown in this picture, you can either plant single or double rows or triple rows, and also for the spacing necessary in silvopastoral system and trees, it is important to consider the goal that you have for that particular tree. If you are interested in nut production, so therefore larger spacing or wider spacing is much better than narrower spacing. And also, if your goal is high quality timber production, you might want to consider using a 3-row system where you can have your tree of choice that you want to grow for high quality timber planted in the middle rows, and outer rows could serve as the trainer for that particular tree. Here is a picture of a potential configuration that eventually you might end up having depending on your objectives. But you really have to consider a lot of factors in your tree planting considerations, such as shade management, mowing and weed control, use of machineries to control those weeds, as well as protecting the trees from grazing, and the final harvest that you would like to have for that particular tree. The Department of Natural Resources has an interesting website that can help you identify specific management guidelines, the specific management and guidelines in taking care of that particularly of choice. Here is the link. You might want to click this one and study further about the tree that you would like to employ in your silvopastoral system. Here is a list of different forages that is suitable in silvopastoral system. Big blue stem, French broom grasses are some examples of native grasses that you might want to implement or plant. Or you can introduce grasses such as Timothy, orchard grass, or Kentucky bluegrass, as well as introduce legumes, white clover and red clovers. What I have listed over here are the typical species that I have seen here in Minnesota that farmers are using in their grazing operation. The University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry has developed a list of different cool season grasses and legumes that can survive under partial shaded environment. So here is a very good information that you can also use in your open pasture system. One of the considerations of establishing trees in open pasture is how are we going to protect the seedlings, particularly during the early stage of establishment. What we have been telling producers, farmers who are interested in planting trees in their open pasture is to protect the seedlings from browsing by deer or by trampling using fencing. You can either use electric fence, wire fencing, or even tubes or cages. But the key in having high survival of seedlings in silvopastoral system is allowing the seedlings to grow first until such time that the new plantings are above the browsing line of the livestock. And most importantly, there's a need to rotate the livestock. So there's a need for you to employ this rotational grazing system. So that is another way of protecting the trees from trampling by livestock. Once the silvopasture is established in an open system, careful management is necessary in order to ensure that livestock, forest, and timber is well balanced. Once the trees have grown up, it is important to allow about 40 to 60% of light to penetrate into the ground because we need to make sure that the forest would continue to grow. Timing of thinning depends on initial stacking as well as the tree growth and product type that you would like to employ. And we have to remember that silvopasture is a complex system. It involves thinning, pruning, and everything like that. So as the system matures, there's a need to employ forest management activities to ensure to improve the quality of the trees, at the same time providing enough sunlight to the forest. As the system matures, ensure that tree-forest compatibility continue to occur into the system. And if the trees continues to provide shade and you don't want to thin them out, you might want to go back to these slides that I have shown earlier and identify what particular species that could grow under more shaded environment. So last slide that I'm going to show you in the context of establishing silvopasture into an open system. This practice, except for planting trees and management of the trees, it follows the same principles in grazing management systems. So in terms of rotational grazing, fencing, as well as rest period and other water systems. Make sure that you have knowledge of this or work with your grazing specialist to make sure that fencing and water systems are strategically located in your operational, in your open silvopastoral system. Last slide is that there's really a benefits of establishing trees in an existing pasture, just like as you can see, this particular picture that the trees are planted along the contours, and one of the benefits of planting the trees like this is to minimize soil erosion. And at the same time, allowing forests to grow. And if you can see, there is economic and environmental benefits that can then be generated in practicing or in converting your open pasture into a silvopastoral system. So that's what I have, and we can pause here for questions before Diane will take the floor.
Okay, yeah, this is Wayne here. Got a few questions. Can you give examples of plants that are toxic to livestock that are common in Minnesota?
This is Tyler here. The first plants that come to mind, particularly woody plants, that you'd be specifically engaging with in silvopasture systems would be prunus. You're looking at choke cherry, primarily choke cherry, but also black cherry, I think. They cause a prussic acid or cyanide poisoning under certain conditions when browsed. They're not immediately toxic, but they can induce toxicity in livestock. Additionally, young oak seedlings and oak acorns have a potential to cause I think it's like a tannic acid poisoning. They're very, very, very high in tannins, and if livestock are allowed to gorge on them, that can be an issue. Those are the ones that first come to mind for me.
In my site, I've seen white snakeroot, and I've heard of bracken being an issue. So there's a lot of also understory species as well as the woody species. I've had mayapple at my site, and I'll talk a little bit about it when I talk about converting woodland. I hadn't planned to, but it's a really good point that Tyler brought up. One of the things is that there's a great list of toxic species that Cornell maintains on their website. But one of the things as you look there, you'll notice that some of our best forage species are listed there as well, like alfalfa. So a lot of times it is a question of also when and how much. So we all know alfalfa bloat can kill livestock. The same is true with prunus. My understanding is if they graze the living fresh leaves, it's actually not an issue. But if they're wilted, so if they graze them after a first frost or after a branch has broken off and the tree and the leaves have started to wilt, then it's a big issue.
Okay. Here's another question. They have a pasture that's heavily populated with reed canary grass. If we were to establish the silvopasture on this field, are there any specific considerations for dealing with this aggressive grass?
Well, it's a sod forming grass, and there are recommended, if you're trying to be rid of it, there are practices to help suppress and weaken that sod, but it is very challenging, but it's your considerations for establishing your trees are really no different than anything else. You need to minimize that competition, utilizing herbicide or mowing or tree mats, or just large enough trees that they can handle it. And but if you're trying to get better, more improved pasture, then the considerations are just doing what you can to weaken that sod, potentially tillage, potentially herbicide, potentially frequent mowing. There are a number of practices. They all have their benefits. They all have their place. But reeds canary grass is very challenging for sure.
Okay. Are coniferous trees considered less desirable than deciduous trees?
Well, I think it really depends on the goal for your operation. Coniferous trees, they provide allelopathic effects sometimes, and it might inhibit the growth of the forest that you might want to produce. But similarly for black walnut, if you are going to be using that, my take on this is it really depends on your ultimate goal for that particular tree.
I think the reason that we have not promoted, overall for silvopasture, the big model in the US is based on coniferous trees. It's our most kind of widespread successful silvopasture is with fast growing pines in the southeastern US. I think the reason we talk more about hardwood species up here is because in the upper Midwest, there's usually not a great market for our softwoods, which grow slowly, but also aren't high value. So as Diomy said, it entirely depends on your goals. The advantage of coniferous trees is if one of your goals is wind shelter in the winter, they're going to provide more wind shelter, particularly when they're young, than deciduous tree. So it's entirely dependent on your goals and your soils.
I think for benefit of time, I'll take one more question. If planting in rows, would you be better off going north, south, or east or west?
I think to maximize the amount of light going into the system, I believe that it should be east to west. But again, it depends on the configuration a lot of your system. Maybe Diane can provide more thoughts on this one.
Yeah. Okay. So again, it depends on where your farm is. So as Diomy pointed out, if you are on slopes, you might want to plant on the contour rather than up and down the contour. From maximizing the light reaching the understory, yes, east to west, but for maximizing shade, you would want to be north to south. If you want to maximize cooling, you actually want to be, at my current theory, is you actually want to be southwest to northeast. And the reason for that is that the two big things that you're, in terms of relieving heat stress for your animals, are one, shade, but also wind. And the prevailing summer winds, particularly when it's hot, are going to be coming from the southwest. So if your rows are oriented southwest to northeast, you're providing shade, but you're not blocking those summer winds. And so you're probably optimizing your cooling. That's kind of my theory. As far as I know, there hasn't been a lot of research on that. But
Well,
it
I
would
agree
be,
to that, Diane. There has not been any research on that. Maybe that is something that we could pursue.
Mhm. Okay, let's move on to Diane's presentation.
all right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to do this. So I'm going to talk about converting woodland to silvopasture, and Tyler already made a lot of the points that I will want to make. I'm trying to figure out how to advance my slide.
I'll do it myself.
Okay. So, and Diomy touched on some of the reasons that you would ideally want to plant your trees rather than start from an existing woodland. But there are some reasons why you would want to start with an existing woodland. And one is the speed, right? You already have large trees. You don't have to wait 10 or 20 years for your trees to be big enough to provide shade. If you're fortunate enough to be in a location where there's a market for the trees that you're taking out, then it's an income source. The actual transition to silvopasture is an income source. That is by no means always the case. In some places, there's not much of a market for a pre-commercial thinning. You may not have high quality trees for timber. So it may cost you money or labor to do that thinning. Another big advantage of converting from an existing woodland is that if timber is one of your goals, your tree form is likely to be better. When you plant in an open pasture, you all know that open grown trees tend to branch fairly low down. Even if you do a double row, they're going to probably not have that wonderful straight form that trees do when they are all growing to, in a woodland setting. But as both Diomy and Tyler pointed out, there are several disadvantages. Conversely to when you plant, you can't select entirely what species you have there. You can select which species you choose to keep, but you have to work with what's there on the site already. Anytime you do a partial thinning, you risk some logging damage to your existing trees. You risk some damage to your soils. I'll a little more about that later. And you are going to be left with stumps that you have to work around. So in addition to the things Tyler mentioned about tree branches falling on fences, if you've thinned a woodland, then you're going to have stumps for at least 4 or 5 years after you do the initial clearing. I'm a huge fan of silvopasture, but there are a lot of times when it's not a good idea to convert your existing woodland to silvopasture. First and foremost, we in Wisconsin have a program called Managed Forest Law, and I think you have a similar program in Minnesota, where for tax benefits you can have a management plan registered with the Department of Natural Resources. And I know in Wisconsin, I believe in Minnesota, that those programs have a restriction on grazing. So you're not allowed to, so don't convert those sites that are under that kind of legal restriction to a silvopasture. There are soils that are probably not suited to livestock impact, right? If your slopes are very, very steep, if you have soils that are often wet and really prone to pugging, that's probably not a good site to convert to silvopasture. If your woods have something sensitive of a value, Tyler mentioned if you have rare species growing there or something else that you want to keep, you have to think carefully before you're going to introduce livestock to the site. If you have young trees that you want to keep, especially if they're less than 4 inches the trunks are less than 4 inches. Livestock sometimes will rub against and damage trees. Sometimes they won't, but there's always that risk. Even if you're rotating grazing, even if you're trying to keep them out at the time of year when they're most likely to be bothered by lice or other things that would cause them to want to rub more, that is a risk that you're running. So that's something to keep in mind. And as Tyler pointed out, it takes a lot more management. So if, you know, it's all you can do to do a good job running your current open pasture operations, then converting existing woodland is going to add some management challenges. And then the other thing is, if your woods have high quality timber, even if the trees are fairly large, you are potentially risking the financial value of that timber if you allow livestock on the site. It's not a for sure thing, but it is a risk you have to take in mind. And that brings us to the next slide, Diomy. Anybody who is thinking of converting an existing woodland, I would strongly encourage you to get a forester to come out and walk the site. Again, in Wisconsin, I know that if you have a minimum acreage, I think it's 20 acres, you can schedule a free walkthrough of the site with a forester by working through DNR. And I would say that's a really good place to start, unless you yourself are, you know, have strong confidence in your forestry knowledge. Get that person to come out, get them to look at it, get them to help you understand what the forestry potential is of the site, what maybe the wildlife potential is of the site, and what you might be putting at risk or not be putting at risk if you convert it to silvopasture. So once you've decided that, yes, it's worth doing it, it's worth, you do want to move it to silvopasture, as you think about what the design of the site is and what trees you're going to keep and what trees you're going to remove, you have to be clear about what your goals are. And you can sometimes make 2 or even 3 goals compatible. But there are some goals that are going to be maybe fundamentally incompatible. So for example, if controlling shrubs is your goal, that might be incompatible with, say, a timber goal or a wildlife goal, because you're going to have to actually do some very intense grazing at times. Controlling shrubs is also one of the, you know, it's a challenging thing to do. It is something that silvopasture can help with, but it's a challenging thing to do. If your goal is timber, you probably would want to keep maybe a denser stand than if your goal is, and also different trees than if your goal is emergency fodder, because the trees that are the highest value timber are not those that make the best emergency fodder. So you want to be clear about your goals when you start. Can we have the next slide? So then one of the sort of first decisions you have to make when you're thinking about how you're going to thin the site and how you're going to convert an existing woodland is whether your paddocks are going to be silvopasture throughout, or whether your paddocks are going to be a blend of silvopasture and open pasture. And there are some pluses and minuses to either design. If it's silvopasture throughout, then you have slightly less of a worry of the animals spending all their time at the sweet spot right at the edge, where they have both the shade and the advantage of the best quality forage, and you might have some issues with the animals damaging that part of the site. The advantage of having silvopasture with open pasture is that in every paddock you have a place where it's very easy for you to manage, or it's much more easy for you to manage, to control, to overview your forage, and you run less of a risk of toxic species. So typically your livestock will understand what species are toxic, or they will be very cautious about grazing new species. They, they learn which species agree with them and which don't. But if you have a silvopasture throughout paddock and you're not on top of rotating them when the really good quality forages have gone, they're much more likely to be led to experiment with some toxic species that might be on that site. So we can move to the next slide. So here are just some images of something I will get to in the next 4 or 5 slides, which are, there's not one way to thin your site once you've decided to go ahead and thin. Basically, the sort of 2 different approaches. One is crop tree thinning, where you want kind of evenly scattered trees. And the other is patch tree thinning, where you're going for clumps of trees surrounded by more open pasture. Crop tree thinning is typically kind of the first thing people think about when converting woodland to silvopasture. And it's based on a silvopasture notion, a silviculture notion of how you take a stand and thin that stand in a way to maximize the growth of your highest value timber trees. So what you do is you go onto the site and you find where your best trees with the best potential for being amazing timber trees are. And then you cut down the trees around them that are competing with them for sunlight so that they have room to grow faster. So in this schematic, it's kind of a bird's eye view of your stand. And I've put a C on the trees that say we've hypothetically determined are your, beautiful looking, straight, undamaged sugar maples and red oaks and, whatever your high value species are that you want to keep. And so next slide, Diomy. So then you've gone in and you've taken away most, in this case, not all, because there might be tangled branches or something like that, but most of the trees, and opened it up so that at least on 3 sides of every crop tree, it's open and it's getting sunlight. So that's one approach. But then there's another approach, which is patch tree thinning. And so there are some real advantages to doing the patch tree thinning approach. One of them is that it's just easier to do the logging. When you're constantly felling your trees around other standing trees you're trying to keep, you don't have an open space to fell your trees and then to skid them out. There's just much more chance of logging damage. But even more important, with patch tree thinning like this schematic shows, where you've taken out trees in rows, you've set yourself up to have rows where you can run equipment in. You can once those stumps are gone after 4 or 5 or however many years, you could come in, you could clip the grass in between those rows of trees. You also have, it's just easier to see what's going on. You could run your fence in that open area. And so while, okay, if you have a big tree fall down, it's still gonna affect your fence. You're not going to have that constant headache that you have when you're running your fence under a bunch of trees of even a little branch that falls off can ground your polywire or knock over that. And then sometimes you wind up doing a cross of the two, right? Your crop trees that you want to keep may not all be scattered evenly throughout the site. So you might wind up doing sort of a crop tree thinning that gives you a kind of a patchy effect at the end. So, this would be an example of that. I think it depends on what your goals are, again, what those trees are you want to keep. There's some big advantages probably the biggest advantage for the scattered tree approach or this approach is that I think it looks kind of pretty. But from a farming perspective, I think there's probably a lot to be said for the practicalities, depending on where the trees are that you want to keep in your goals, of doing patch tree thinning that gives you some clear alleys in between where your trees are. A couple of things you want to keep in mind. Diomy already mentioned this. You want to aim for no more than 50% canopy covered after you've done your initial thinning. And you might want to go down to 30%. It's attention, because when you first thinned a site, your trees are, they've been grown in a stand, and they're used to having a lot of trees around them. They're used to having that protection from wind of being in a full stand. And so they are more susceptible to breaking or wind throw for the first 5 or 6 years after thinning. So from that perspective, you might want to leave a few more trees than you ultimately want to wind up with. However, once their canopies have light all around them, typically those canopies fill out and get bigger really quickly. So my experience was that on my site, I thinned too cautiously. So I am inclined to tell people, go more towards that 30 to 40% canopy coverage, because those trees will fill in. You'll lose a few, but they will also fill in. And if you have more than 50% shade, you really compromise your forage growth under those trees. Really important to make sure that your thinning, your logging is conducted when the ground is either frozen or dry. This is a photo of sort of long-term damage from someone who was working with a logger who came in when they shouldn't have and really tore up their roads getting to the site. You just don't want that long-term soil damage, that long-term just road damage that you have to deal with. And then also, if you have oaks present, you want to be aware that you don't want to conduct thinning. At least in Wisconsin, I don't know how much you have oak wilt throughout Minnesota, but I assume you do, at least in eastern Minnesota. We basically say from April through July, you're at risk of spreading oak wilt if you do any cutting. Okay, next slide. When you thin your site, even if you are removing the trees and selling them for timber, there's a lot of stuff there that there's not a market for, and that actually you kind of want to keep on the site, because it represents a lot of carbon that you don't want to be taking off your site. But you do need to have a plan for what you're going to do with it, because otherwise you can't get into the site. You can't spread the seed to plant your forages. So typically people just rake it into piles or rows, and you might want to have your logger help you do that. So that's called a slash. And then really important, I think, to plant your forages that you want soon after you've done your thinning. If you don't, you'll get opportunistic things coming in, and while there's a chance they might be things you want, there's also a good chance they could be toxic species. They could be shrubs that you don't want there, like multiflora rose or barberry or buckthorn, or things you don't want. And getting a good forage layer established quickly is a really good tool to prevent the things you don't want from getting established. Diomy talked about what some shade tolerant mixes are. In my site, really the only thing that did well, probably because I didn't thin hard enough, was orchard grass. Festuloleum did okay as well. I think if you thinned harder, you would be able to use more of the things from the list that Diomy shared. How do you establish that if you can't bring equipment in because there's all those stumps in the way? You can take an ATV and adapt it to do some broadcasting. You can, if it's a small area, you could broadcast by hand. It's good, at least one SARE grant has found that it's very helpful to bring livestock in after you've broadcast by hand and have them be there working the seed in after that. They've also found that if you winter feed them with baled hay, if it's seedy, that can actually cause good forage establishment. So those are some general tips for what you might want to do that. And as Tyler mentioned, yeah, regular fence inspection is a must, because there's there's constantly branches, little twigs that drop and that can ground out your fence. Okay, next slide. This is just a picture of one SARE grant site in Wisconsin where the guy had a 25-year-old spruce plantation, spruce pine, white pine plantation. And this is before. Okay, next slide, Diomy. And then he went in and worked with a logger, took out 2/3 of the trees. And this is, the grass establishment he got. He's the one who found that having the livestock come in and work the seed in with their hooves was really helpful. I just hand broadcast on my site, and then they did take, and his site, it was important to have the livestock work it in with their hooves. Just another view of the same site, and I think that's my last slide.
Yes. Oh. Lance?
Yes, sir. Well, good morning, everybody. I will give you the what USDA NRCS has for options for silvopasture. Next slide, please. I will go through our practice standard for silvopasture. So the definition of silvopasture is any place that we can establish and manage desired trees and forages on the same land unit. Next. So the purpose of this practice, as everybody has already discussed, is quite varied, from providing shade for livestock, improved water quality, reducing erosion, soil quality. There's many purposes. Next. Condition. We've also discussed this, that the condition where we can apply this practices is on any landform that is suitable for forage, livestock, and trees. Not all landforms are going to be suitable for silvopasture for a specific species. In the eastern part of Minnesota, we have some landforms called the goat prairies. These may be areas that you could establish silvopasture if you were grazing goats, but not cattle. You're into very steep terrain that just is not suitable for grazing cattle on. Next, please. So when it comes to planning, like Tyler was talking about early on, you really need to consider what you're undertaking here. This is very complex, a forest management plan plus a livestock grazing plan. Now you're talking about putting the two of these together and being able to manage both. So for EQIP, our Environmental Qualities Incentive Program, we have two scenarios, and they're both for the establishment of silvopasture. Next. So the first is establishing pine into an existing pasture. The payment scenario, or the payment for this scenario, is $96.25 an acre. Next. Okay, so on these EQIP scenarios, it is just a generic description, if you will. So that means you don't have to establish pine trees. You can establish any tree that would meet your goals and the practice purpose. So, as been discussed, whether that be fruit trees, nut trees, whatever that might be, would be allowable. Existing pasture, that again can be one of a number of things. Existing native grass pasture. You may have some what would be truly introduced cool season pasture, or expiring CRP that you want to convert into silvopasture. The other scenario we have is to commercially thin a pine plantation and establish native grasses. $473.44 an acre. This is just the generic scenario description. So you could go into any land form that would be suitable for the grazing of livestock and thin whatever those existing trees were, whether it be oaks or whatever it may be that is already there. You know, keeping your desirable species, removing whatever the undesirables are, and then establishing perennial forage. And that could be native grasses or introduced grasses. So the financial assistance through USDA on this program is, like I said, the main one would be EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. Applications can be completed at any time throughout the year at your local USDA NRCS service center. Now, an application, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be in that year's funding, and I'll kind of explain that because you want to apply early. We have what we call ranking and funding deadlines. This year's deadline is the 20th of November. So if you walk in on the 19th and sign up for an application for EQIP, you would be best to, you can sign it and sign up for it, but to be deferred until the following year's ranking and funding go around, because in one day is not enough time for conservation planners, foresters, and you to get a solid plan in place that is going to work for your operation. You need to have time to, like Tyler was saying, plan this out so that it's going to work for you into the future. You know, NRCS planners, this isn't their plan. They're helping you as a producer develop a plan for you and try to make something that is productive, stable, and sustainable on into the future. So spend the time to plan first, and then once that is completed and you know it's going to work, you know, you've had time to think about it, then you can worry about getting into a contract. Thank you. That's all I have.
I think we're moving into mine. I'm Terri Peters. Just without the ON on there, I guess. Missed that, Diomy. I am the manager at the Wabasha Soil and Water. We are co-located with NRCS, and sometimes we might direct you to some of their programs, but we do have a little bit of flexibility and sometimes have our own programs or programs with other partners that can be used. So I was asked today to talk about a specific project that we did with Tom Hunter. And this was just to kind of get started on an oak savanna restoration that he had in mind. And in moving forward with this is kind of the area that you're looking at there is kind of what he was starting with. And he had some invasives in there, some buckthorn. And it was important for me to, well, first understand what Tom's goals were. I see he's on there, so he can correct me if I get anything wrong here. But he did have some aerial imagery of pre-settlement, what the area looked like, and it was pretty wide open and grassy, and, you know, maybe with a few oaks scattered across the hills. So yes, the, you know, buffalo and elk and whatever may have roamed across there, but they didn't stay there. So it wasn't really, it's not really meant, those hillsides, to be grazed constantly. Next slide. This is just some more of the area that he wanted to clear out. There's also some cedar, which is not beneficial to an oak savanna system. So this is kind of what he started with, and he had a plan that he wanted to maybe have somebody come in there with chainsaws and just cut down all of the undesirable area and clear it, and was hoping that some of the native vegetation would reestablish naturally, because you could see some of that happening in another part of the landscape. We have a program that's called the Cooperative Weed Management Area Program. Not all SWCDs have this. It is meant to be used for, controlling weed threats and managing invasive species. And also part of that includes integrating a restoration or reconstruction approach, and that can be natural regeneration. So that is what we used. And there's a website, you can link to the Bowser website to find more on that program. You could ask your local SWCD if they work with that program. And even if they don't, next slide, they might be able to use the 314 practice standard for cost share for state funding or other programs. So that's a brush management. And so the goal here was to just clear an area. And I knew that Tom, he already had a managed grazing plan. And so it's important to understand for us the management style of the producer, as I think has been said a few times here, not all areas are meant to be grazed. And the goal here was just to have flash grazing and have a area that would have trees and shade for the hotter times in summer, that cattle could just be led in there for a brief time. So, some of the definition of that brush management includes improving forage accessibility. And so, it just made it a fit for this project. And all SWCDs are set up differently. They can kind of design some of their own, how they want to do the cost share. We do like a flat rate on some of our programs with the cooperative weed management area. And in this case, I used Iowa custom farm rates to figure out, how many hours of chainsaw work it might be and a day with a skid loader to move some of that stuff out. And Tom had plenty more cost, I think, besides what we cost shared on. Next slide. So this, Tom waved his magic wand, and this is kind of what it looked like when he had a workshop out there this summer. So I think he had a little bit more work in trying to figure out what to do with some of the slash there, and there is a ravine kind of behind him. So I think it worked out well so far, and looking forward to seeing how that management goes in the future. And that's my contact information if anybody has any questions for me.
Okay, this is Wayne again, and I think we have a few questions that I'd like to ask. Are poison oak and poison sumac hazardous to livestock?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't think poison ivy is, and it's the same class, but I think, again, it would depend, right? You don't want to put them in a situation where they run out of other good forage and there's just a bunch of poison oak and poison sumac left.
Okay, here's another question. It seems many foresters have been trained to manage trees for timber and not necessarily for savanna. For example, an open growth form white oak may be considered low quality based on its value for its timber, but for savanna restoration, that same tree is a keystone species. Do you have any tools or frameworks that help landowners decide trees that should be saved or culled?
I did kind of type an answer to that one in the chat box. DNR does have some biological survey information, and I included a link where you can find that. And when we're looking at doing a restoration project, a lot of times we'll look at that to see what the biological survey says, to see what trees might be most suitable and do well in that area. So that can be helpful. Yeah, DNR, a lot of their time is spent on the timber management, but they do have some PFM resources available, you know, for private forestry management. And some districts, our district will work with forestry landowners. We have some programs to assist as well.
I would say that, you know, I think that's a key reason to do the goal setting process at the beginning, because if you are really after the wildlife and or the, you know, more broad wholesale oak savanna ecosystem restoration and all that it brings, you're going to be looking to keep different trees for sure. If timber is really something that is bringing you to the table for silvopasture, then you're going to also be looking at very different trees. And there are just basic crop tree features that help you select keeper trees, crop trees. Also, one thing that I wonder about is we often, and I've said this at a few of the field days, is that we often lean towards keeping the big trees. You know, we're attracted by the big, old, huge trees, but in many cases, those trees are not going to put on as much growth and add as much value to the system over time as the well-established middle-aged tree that is in, you know, sort of the prime of its life and is going to be adding more and more, you know, harvestable mass over the next, say, 10 or 20 years that you would have, you know, sort of be accruing, you know, value to the system versus the big tree that isn't going to grow as much.
Totally agree with that, Tyler. I would just add, one of the things that foresters say is depends on tree size is not always a great guide to tree age. And so if you had an even age stand, then you do probably want to keep your bigger trees because your smaller trees are just the ones that weren't as competitive. So those are really important things to keep in mind. And basically, I would look for tree health like as a really important first starting point. But yeah, your goals are going to determine what you want to keep.
Okay. When you say forester, do you mean a service forester from a state DNR or a private forester?
Well, I can start, and then I'm sure Terri probably has some really good, more Minnesota-centric. In Wisconsin, it could be either. And our DNR has a list of foresters who are private foresters, but who are registered with DNR and, you know, understand what DNR's concerns and criteria are. But the initial contact point, I think, in Wisconsin would be to go through DNR to arrange that free site visit.
Yeah, I think it's similar, and it depends on what program you're working with. I think with NRCS, and Lance can confirm this, you would they would have DNR staff. They have an agreement with them that DNR can look at some of their projects and approve them, or a technical service provider. I'm not necessarily sure that about the silvopasture practice, how that works, but district projects, we can get there are private foresters that work, you know, in limited numbers if you can get them around here. Otherwise, DNR forestry.
Yes, and you're correct, Terry. We use try to you know, get a DNR forester to assist with that. And like I said before, you know, not only are you getting a forester, but you're getting somebody that's approved to develop a grazing system on that too, you know, and having that work in conjunction.
I think I remember in the past that there are foresters who are now looking into working with silvopasture topics from a consulting foresters group in Minnesota. So that is another resource that you guys can look at it too.
Okay, I think we'll move on to, we're running out of time, so I think we'll start to close down. So here's some examples of funding sources to go for different, EQIP, Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program out of Minnesota Department of Ag. Minnesota Department of Ag's got some different kinds of grants as well as loan programs. USDA SARE has a Farmer Rancher grant program. So some opportunities for funding. Okay, next slide. Some of the Silvopasture resources. A lot of these are on the SFA's Silvopasture page on the website. Podcasts, webinars interviews are there. So take a look at the SFA's website. Also want to encourage people to join the Silvopasture Learning Network. This is managed by Minnesota Extension Service, and it promotes the learning, advocacy, and volunteer efforts to expand natural resource conservation. And we encourage you to become a member of that network and stay up to date on some of the stuff that are coming down the pipe on that. As well as soon after this webinar, we'll be sending out an evaluation form for what you thought about the webinar and things that you would like to see done in future education events and so on. So we encourage you to fill that out and send it back in. That helps the SFA plan for future events. And here's a slide on all the contact information from our presenters today.
Just want to, sorry, I didn't go all the way through the slides. I had another presentation this morning. My phone number is wrong. My email is correct. So that phone number looks like it's Terri, or it looks like it's Lance Smith's phone number, not mine.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that
I'm sorry, I will correct it before posting it to the website.
Yeah, so this webinar PowerPoint will be posted on our SFA's website, and I want to thank everyone for participating. Have a happy Thanksgiving and stay safe and healthy. So thank you much. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.